Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cast of Kings, a decoding TV recap podcast about the HBO original series, House of the Dragon. I'm David Chen, and I haven't read Fire and Blood, the book on which House of the Dragon is based.
And I'm Kim Renfro, and I have read Fire and Blood, the book upon which House of the Dragon is based.
Every week on A Cast of Kings, we recap, review, spoil, discuss this week's episode of House of the Dragon. This week, we'll be discussing Season 1, Episode 6, The Princess and the Queen. Lots to get into there, but before we do that, I want to read an email that someone wrote into decodingtv@gmail.com. You can also write into acastofkings@gmail.com. Find more episodes of this show at acastofkings.com and find us on YouTube and TikTok, youtube.com/acastofkings and tiktok.com/atacastofkings. Dustin writes in, quote, I've been listening to your Cast of Kings and Decoding Westworld podcast for years. First, just want to say how much I love the addition of Kim Renfro for House of the Dragon. She is so entertaining and fun to listen to. Even though I love your podcast, I was really skeptical hearing about the decodingtv.com paid model because $10 a month is steep, and it didn't seem like there could be enough content to warrant that kind of platform. Then when I realized it was completely your thing, I wanted to give it a chance. So I listened to every podcast on the main Decoding TV feed. And I started watching She-Hulk so I wouldn't be spoiled, ending with your recent thoughtful Rogue One recap to kick off Andor. I was pretty blown away. You found exceptional and very different co-hosts for all of these shows, and I love all of them. And you are somehow putting just as much love into all these shows each week. No longer skeptical. I just joined up as a founding member of decodingtv.com and hope you're able to keep it going. For what it's worth, I think a lot of listeners will be even more excited to join up if they realize it's truly your network. So I wouldn't be shy about saying Decoding TV is yours and that you are doing all these shows. When I first heard about it, I thought it was just some random existing podcast community and was like, Dave Chen sold out. I'm not paying for that. I think that people who know these podcasts as yours, especially longtime listeners, will be happy to support it, knowing the new model is your creation too. Thanks again for all the enjoyable hours of listening. You're my weekly companions on walks, runs, and pushing kids everywhere in the jogging stroller. My older two kids used to be in the strollers while I listened and now enjoy the recaps of the shows they watch, including She-Hulk and now Andor in the car. And my two little ones, who are 1 and 3 years old, have replaced them in the strollers while I catch up on House of the Dragon. Now we can both feel old.
That's an amazing email.
I agree. It's a great email from Dustin. And, I've done I'll say moderately poor job of explaining what Decoding TV is, I think, because I've wanted to keep the focus on A Cast of Kings and on House of the Dragon. But yes, Decoding TV is a podcast network that I have launched that includes A Cast of Kings and the Decoding TV podcast. I am currently a co-host on every show, and we're recapping multiple shows. So if you are unaware of that, be sure to check out the Decoding TV podcast at podcast.decodingtv.com. And again, as always, if you want to support us, you can become a paid member at decodingtv.com. But yeah, we're currently covering She-Hulk, Andor, as well as The Lord of the Rings of Power. And I have awesome co-hosts for each of those shows as well. All right, Kim Renfro, let's talk about Season 1, Episode 6 of House of the Dragon, The Princess and the Queen. Before we even start with overall thoughts, let's start by talking about a revised opening credit sequence. Now, we have discussed previously how the opening credits in Game of Thrones was very informative and gave us information, and now it seems like House of the Dragon is trying to do the same, right?
Yeah, so just in the same way that Game of Thrones would sometimes update the opening credits with like new locations that you were seeing, they would even switch the sigils on castles. Like I remember it was kind of a big deal when like the Stark sigil was finally on Winterfell again in the opening credits instead of House Bolton. So it seems like they're doing the same thing here where they're going to be updating the opening credits anytime that there's like a significant new branch in the Targaryen family tree. So this one, the first one that I noticed was that Daemon now has his own little highlight point, and his sigil on his little blood circle is his winged dragon helmet. We saw him wear that in the pilot episode when he was fighting in the tournament. And so even before the episode started, if you were like really looking, you would know that at this point that Daemon is not only going to be back, but that he's now married to Laena Velaryon, and they have 2 children. So they had 2 daughters, Baela and Rhaenyra.
All right. So, yeah, we'll probably get more updates in the future, depending on how things play out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. But new opening title sequence or an update to the title sequence, and we'll see how it evolves as the season goes on. Good eye, Kim, as usual. All that said, let's talk about overall thoughts on season 1, episode 6. What did you think of this episode of House of the Dragon?
I really enjoyed it. This was the final episode in the batch of press screeners that I had in advance. So it was nice to be able to like see how that time jump played out. And I was just really taken immediately by both Emma Darcy and Olivia Cook stepping into the roles of Rhaenyra and Alicent, respectively. Yeah, so much happened. Like, they covered way more ground in a single episode than I probably would have guessed. But so far, I've just kind of been enjoying the ride of like seeing exactly how they're deciding to adapt all of these different, like, fast-paced events from Fire and Blood.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I want to start by saying I've had such a great time making this podcast with you, Kim.
We've been getting along so well.
We've been getting along so well. The feedback from the listeners has been great. And let's just take a moment to just like cherish that, before I say what I'm about to say next.
Okay.
But yes, it's been so awesome so far. Kim Renfro has been one of the best collaborators I've ever had. And we will continue to collaborate on House of the Dragon related stuff.
I feel like you're breaking up with me.
But I had massive problems with the time jumps. And it's really weighed on me because I know people don't listen to a Cast of Kings, aka a House of the Dragon podcast, to hear me complain about House of the Dragon. Like, that's not why people listen to and enjoy this podcast. And so I want to honor people's intention of wanting to listen to the podcast while also being true to myself, while also reflecting complaints that I think a lot of people have. I'm going to read a smattering of headlines this morning. /film.com. House of the Dragon's latest time skip is its first big stumble. GameRant.com. House of the Dragon. Are the time jumps hurting the pacing? That was actually from a couple weeks ago. Forbes.com. House of the Dragon's time jump and recastings are pretty jarring. So those are just like a few headlines this morning, and that's not even counting all the tweets that I saw last night from people literally saying they're going to stop watching the show because of how bad the time jump was. I'm not exaggerating. Like, at least half a dozen people tweeted at me saying like, I'm not watching the show anymore because of how bad the time jump was.
I really did not anticipate that big of a reaction to this episode. It's really interesting. I have some thoughts on why that's the case. I mean, so to be clear, I did not like the time jump, and I did not like. Wait, what? What are you saying?
I did not. We've already spent so long talking about time jumps on this podcast. But I did not appreciate the time jump. I thought the way it was done was made for really, really rough storytelling from a TV watcher's perspective. And virtually every single complaint I have with this episode stems back to the time jumps. So I'm going to try not to be repetitive as we go through this episode. So just I want listeners to know, I know it's boring to hear me complain about the time jump. Like, I understand that. At the same time, I am probably going to do that at least a little bit in this episode. So and I'll try to get it all out right now, like most of it right now. But I think that what's happened this episode is there has been a 10-year time jump, and several of the actors have been recast. The two biggest ones being Rhaenyra and Alicent. Strangely, other characters have not been, like a bunch of other characters have not been recast, and that's a little bit weird and jarring to see. Like Sir Cristen and King Viserys, and like all these other people have not been recast. I know some of it makes more sense than others, but anyway. And I know, Kim, you've written extensively about this, why these specific actors were chosen to be recast. So we don't need to relitigate the recasting, but I think that so much stuff has happened off screen that it feels like the show wants us to invest in these new actors and kind of their existing storylines when the show has not given us enough to do so. The biggest example of this being that we get to spend a ton more time in this episode, or a ton more time in this episode with Sir Harwin and Laena, right? Is that Daemon's wife?
Yep.
Before they are unceremoniously killed in this episode. So, like, why didn't we spend the last 5 episodes getting to know those characters more if their deaths were going to play such a big role in this episode? I think that, we can talk more about like how they could have done it differently later on as we go on, but like one of the big challenges is that they gave us this earlier stuff because they wanted to flesh it out more. And I honestly, looking back on it, think it was probably a mistake. Like, I think they should have just started with these new actors and like let it play out from that point, so we get to know what Rhaenyra and Harwin's relationship is. We get to know what Daemon and Laena's relationship is before these deaths occur, which are supposed to be shocking and upsetting. But instead, I feel nothing because I don't know. I just met these characters, and now you want me to feel something for their deaths. It doesn't. I know we met them earlier, but like, you know what I mean? Got to know them this episode. And then on the flip side of that, like the other reason why, like flip side of the same issue is the other actors who played Alicent and Rhaenyra were so good that everyone got super invested in those characters, their plot lines, and what was going on at that point in time. And now it's like, oh, they're gone. Like we're never going to see them again, probably. And all that stuff they're dealing with, guess what? They're dealing with basically a whole different set of issues. Like, yes, some of the same themes, but they're basically dealing with a whole different set of issues. That is jarring. It eliminates momentum. It eliminates viewer trust and engagement in the show. And it makes it feel like, why am I bother investing in any of this? Is if like you could jump forward 5 years next episode and we're on a whole different set of tasks and topics and conflicts. So that is as best as I can articulate the big issues with this time jump. Is we're jumping forward in time. We're skipping a bunch of stuff. We're like destroying any momentum we had with the earlier characters who did such a good job and became so beloved to a huge portion of the community. And so far, at least, the trade-off has not been worth it. Now, I'll say one last thing before we get into the episode itself, which is the case for the time jumps. Now, I'm not going to make the full-throated case for the time jumps because I don't believe in that very much. But I will say that what a lot of people have said is that, hey, maybe speculative, maybe the time jump is to bring us to where the most important action is going to happen, and also that the time jumps will not be as frequent or as drastic from this point forward. If that is the case, then it's like, okay, you can just read the first 5 episodes as an extended prologue for the main action of the show. And that's fine. Maybe it's like, oh, we just had to get through it, and then now we're really cooking with gas, And if that's the case, like, fine, that probably will make sense. Still think it would have made more sense to spend, like, if somebody wrote in saying, like, we didn't need to spend time with Tyrion as a young child, like, getting to know how unhappy his childhood was, right, in Game of Thrones. We just started with them as adults, and they would vaguely and obliquely refer to, like, some of the stuff that happened in the past, and that was completely fine. It was completely fine. And it made for a less jarring storytelling experience. I haven't seen the whole picture yet, so I don't know where this is all going to net out. But based off of what I've seen so far, it really does feel like they should have taken that approach. They should have taken the approach of, let's just start with these adults. We get to know these characters, these relationships, so that these arcs can feel meaningful when a character like Sir Harwin dies. Because right now, I don't feel anything. Okay. Any reaction to that before we dive into the episode?
Yeah, I was like... yes, I have so many thoughts. I think that you totally are correct in that, like, now that I've seen these first 6 episodes, especially like multiple times, it seems really clear to me that yes, like the first 5 episodes are almost acting like a prologue within the prequel itself.
Yeah.
And it's interesting.
Which, by the way, itself had a prologue. Like, there was that whole King Jaehaerys.
Right. So
there's a little prologue there, yeah.
We have like a voiceover prologue to the 5-episode prologue to the 10-episode prequel season, right?
Yeah.
And I think that a big I think that for a lot of people, sort of like the line between whether the time jumps bother you or not might have to be with whether you've read Fire and Blood or not. Because like I came into the story not sure exactly where they were going to begin in terms of like the action, like the meat of the plot. There were so many places where they could have decided to do that. And we know so little about like the interior lives of all the characters involved in this Targaryen history, because the book is not written as like a typical novel. And we knew very little about, say, like Alicent's upbringing. Like in the book, Alicent, it pretty much just starts her characterization with what we see of Alicent in this episode, right? Which is that she's like the queen. She seems to have her own agenda, and she has placed herself in opposition to Rhaenyra. I think that having these 5 episodes of like prologue backstory about their childhoods, their relationships, all of those things add to my appreciation of what is about to now happen between these families in the upcoming episodes. But I have the foresight of like knowing exactly how much more intense it's going to get, or knowing which deaths are supposed to like land in which particular way. And so while yes, I could have used more time with Harwin and Laena, I think especially Laena, I think that was the biggest misstep for me in this episode. Introducing her like in adulthood and married to Daemon, and then so quickly dispatching of her. But yeah, I don't know. I think that because my expectations were pretty much like, I don't know what they're going to do with this show. Like, I've just sort of been enjoying the ride, and kind of like, I've been really intrigued to see the things that they decide to include or change or sort of reset at varying points in the story. So to me, I didn't lose any momentum going into this episode. I felt like, oh, now I understand why Rhaenyra is acting the way that she's acting when she's grown up and has these children, and like why Alicent and Cristen are suddenly allies. Like in the book, that's not really like, you don't really understand why all of a sudden they're being buddy. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sure as we start going through the episode and talking about specifics, I will come up with more eloquent reasons why I don't mind. Like,
well, I think you know, as you pointed out to me in our pre-show chat, a lot of the differences come down to whether you read the book or not. Yeah, and I think for show watchers, their entire 80 to 90% of their understanding of this world is from those actors playing those characters, right? Of this in House of Dragon so far. And I think people such as myself got really invested in those characters. And I think for you, you're watching, you're like, wow, there's all this detail here that we never even got in the books. This is amazing. And for us, we're like, this is the show I'm invested in. This is it. This is the show. And for the show to then just be like, nope, it's not the show anymore. It's a whole different thing now. I'm not exaggerating. Like, I thought to myself, okay, I don't think I would have the reaction that a lot of people have of like, I'm not watching the show anymore. But I might have come close to it. Like if I wasn't hosting this podcast with you, I might have been like, yeah, okay, like I don't really care about this anymore. Like that's possible. One of the reasons I'm not is because the first 5 episodes were so good, right? Yeah. Like, and it's like, okay, these people clearly have some sense of what they're doing. I still have like they've built up a lot of goodwill in terms of their storytelling abilities in the first 5 episodes, and so like I'm willing to like stick around and see where this goes. But if I hadn't enjoyed the first 5 episodes so much, if like my enjoyment was a little bit less, I could see myself being out of here as well. And that's, I think, a reasonable reaction, because I think people feel toyed with in a way, you know? People get really invested, and then the characters are gone and we're on to a whole different set of stuff. So anyway.
My one counterpoint to that is that I don't think that this is like a reset of all of these characters. Like they are very much carrying all of the events that we saw unfold in the first 5 episodes with them in their current allegiances and parent-child relationships, et cetera, et cetera. But let's get into specifics.
All right, Kim. The episode opens with another childbirth scene. Who would have thought that House of Dragon would be so focused on childbirth this episode? I love it, personally. I think it's like, it is some of the most graphic and feels like grounded depictions of childbirth that I've seen on screen in general. Like when you're watching a normal TV show, the woman strains, the guy faints, and then this baby comes out from behind the sheets, and then that's the childbirth. But like, what House of the Dragon depicts is a world in which childbirth is terrifying and dangerous, and incredibly painful, and you really experience that pain and trauma and all of the emotions and feelings that go with it in a scene like the opening sequence of this episode, which is a long continuous shot that lasts several minutes, right? So in this scene, we are watching Rhaenyra have her third child, right? And again, it's 10 years later from the last episode. And she is able to bring forward the child successfully, and then immediately she's told, "Hey, the queen wants to see the child." And so she's like, "Okay, well, I'm not gonna give the child to the queen, by itself, because I don't trust that. So I'm gonna have to walk there myself." And then that's the sequence that follows. But any thoughts on this opening childbirth sequence, Kim Renfro?
I thought it was incredible. I thought of all the ways to introduce us to Rhaenyra as an adult, I think like dropping us right into her in childbirth and sort of mirroring her mother's experience. You sort of feel what I assume is a lot of fear and like anxiety that she has as she's like wondering if this is going to be the time that childbirth kills me the way that it killed my mother. And I just thought Emma Darcy like moves through so many emotions with their face in this shot, and like the single tracking shot allowing for us to see the performance track from like strain, birth, joy, immediate annoyance with like Alicent, and then the determination that Rhaenyra has to like literally have her gown be put onto her as she's like still sweating and covered in afterbirth and bleeding. And I thought it was incredible. Like I couldn't believe that they were doing like that full tracking shot. Seeing the way that they were able to like use the sets, like move from their fully built out set of like the Rhaenyra's chambers into the hallway, into the staircase, up to the queen's chambers, and seeing like the way that the court is responding to her. It also totally reminded me of like the real world tradition that the royal family has in the UK of like coming out with the baby. Like I remember seeing pictures of Kate Middleton, like apparently hours after she had given birth to one of the little royal babies. I don't remember which one, maybe Charlotte. But like the fact that like a team of people had to go in for Kate Middleton and like blow dry her hair and make her look like she wasn't a woman who had just gone through like this really exerting experience of childbirth and photograph her like nicely. It was like seeing the medieval version of that, of like what it would actually look like for a woman to have to move from giving childbirth to being like presentable at court immediately.
Yeah. As we've already mentioned, the episode opens with two long continuous shots, and I think they kind of serve different functions for me, just watching it visually, right? The first is the function of the first long continuous shot is that it takes place, because long continuous shots take place in real time. Like we are then experiencing this moment with Rhaenyra in a way we wouldn't if it was edited back and forth. Like we see the whole performance and we see it play out in graphic detail, and there's all these little details like the afterbirth and the clipping of the umbilical cord and all these things that, again, a lot of TV shows or films usually gloss over in the childbirth process that we then get to experience in real time. Maybe a little bit of an abridged version of it in real time in the show. Then, as you point out, the second shot, it really does expose us to the geography of these sets. And the purpose of a long tracking shot like this is, in my opinion, that you get to see, you feel the environment, right? Typically, with a sequence that has a lot of edits in it, they can cheat the environment. They can be like, "Oh, we've just built like this 20% piece of this wall, and a half of the staircase, and so on." But with a long continuous shot like this, it's like that's impossible because they're walking up they're interacting with the environment, and so you get a better feeling of the Red Keep as a physical place that exists in the real world. And so, yeah, I thought both of the opening long continuous shots kind of served different purposes for me, and did a pretty good job.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, she meets Alicent, who is being fitted for a new dress, and Kim Renfro, you noticed something in Alicent's room that was a little bit different than it was before, right?
Yeah. People had pointed this out before in the first batch of episodes, but all throughout the Red Keep, there are these either like tapestries or mosaics that are just like orgy scenes everywhere. And I think it kind of added to the idea that the Targaryens are like this lusty, slightly like non-traditional set of rulers. And the room where Queen Alicent is now living is the same room where Queen Aemma lived. And we've seen so many examples or so many shots of like Alicent or like Criston Cole kind of standing in that room, and you could see those nude orgy tapestries behind them. And then in this episode, all of a sudden those are gone, and they've been replaced with sort of like plain, just like tiled whatever, almost as if she had them like fully covered up. So I think it's just it was like a cool background detail that establishes like, okay, Alicent is now like setting herself in opposition to the Targaryen traditions and customs of the Red Keep. And she's really hewing to like the faith of the Seven and what she views as like decency and courtly behavior.
In praise of the time jumps, I think that's kind of something that a time jump lets you have in a good way. Is like that's a cool background detail that gives you some understanding of the character and what they've done in the past, and you can kind of fill in the blanks for yourself. And that is how much information I need about that detail, but there's other details that have changed that it's like, not sure if we should have skipped over that. So the biggest one being Sir Criston Cole is at the door. He is now guarding Alicent. I think a lot of people might ask the question. Now, I can understand why Sir Criston Cole might be guarding Alicent. They clearly like formed a bond in the last episode, and you can kind of fill in some blanks of, oh yeah, of course, like she trusts him because he seems like a decent, upstanding individual. He was honest with her when no one else would be. Great, I understand that. Why was Sir Criston Cole forgiven for caving that guy's head in, at the last episode? Maybe that will be explained later, but it's like, feels like a big detail to gloss over, because it feels like some people would be pretty upset about that from last episode.
I think that, and not to jump ahead too much, but like the fact that Harwin, beats the crap out of Criston in like a much less obviously fatal way than Criston did to Joffrey. I think that we're just seeing that like the Kingsguard are basically like the super cops of the realm. And if like the king or queens says that what they did was okay, I guess that everyone's just supposed to go along with that. So I'm guessing that in my head,
it's an incisive look at the unaccountability of police in Westeros, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Pretty much.
Fair enough. So they have a conversation between Alicent, Rhaenyra. Laenor is also there. And by the way, Laenor at this point seems like a gentleman. He's like, hey, he seems concerned about his wife's pain that she went through. He's like, let me take your hand. I want to at least put up a good front. And Alicent sees the child. Viserys sees the child. Viserys is super psyched. Viserys is just happy to be around at this point. Alive, around. He seems to be missing like an arm at this point. Like he's missing like a whole appendage.
Yeah,
I think.
I'm pretty sure that arm that it's like he got nicked on the Iron Throne in the pilot, and then he was missing 2 fingers in the next episode. A few episodes later, we saw that like it seemed to have spread all the way up his arm, and then here in the jump forward, he seems to have had a full amputation done to that arm.
Yeah, so his body is clearly rejecting the Iron Throne at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. And his face seems to be like he's losing hair. He's got little
decaying,
scabbies.
Yeah. And Alicent says to Sir Laenor, do keep trying, Sir Laenor. Sooner or later, you might get one that looks like you. Indicating that none of the 3 children, pointing out what many people can see, which is that none of the 3 children look like Sir Laenor, who is half black in the show.
Mm-hmm. With the silvery hair of, like the silver white hair. Like the fact that both him and Rhaenyra have blonde hair. Blonde white, like the blonde white Targaryen Valyrian hair, and then none of their children seem
none of the children are all brown haired, basically, right? So
and plain featured, I think is what Alicent calls them, which is so rude.
Mm-hmm. In the books, I guess they did, because I don't think Sir Corlys is black in the book, is he, or explicitly?
No, yeah, the Valyrians aren't black, so
So I guess they did it with just the hair in the books. Yeah,
I think is supposed to be the point, because I guess right. So Viserys, who has the blonde Targaryen hair, has been having children with Alicent, who has brown hair, but all of their children have silver blonde Targaryen hair. So I guess the side-eyeing is like, why would this not? Like, it almost seems like, and you know, this came up in Game of Thrones too, the whole idea that like, which also the seed is strong is like a phrase that was very common in Game of Thrones, and the fact that Harwin's last name is Strong. There's some puns. There's some puns happening here, but like,
I like it.
The idea that I guess like blonde Targaryen hair historically has always been like the winning gene that gets passed along to children. I don't know exactly what all the biology facts of Westeros are, but like there's some loose science happening there with the little Punnett square of what color eyes and hair your kids should have.
Clearly, Alicent has a very firm understanding of Mendelian genetics and recessive genes.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
But whatever the case is, people are now, for reasons passing my understanding, Kim.
Okay.
Just now, it's starting to become a problem that all of her children are brown haired. You know, not in the at any point in the 10 years prior to this wasn't a huge issue, but now it's coming to a head, I guess.
I got the sense that like this has been bothering, and like Viserys says that Alicent brought it up to her before.
Yeah,
I think that Alicent and Cristen have been on the we hate Rhaenyra and her plain featured children train for like the last 10 years, but this is the episode where we're seeing both of them start to get more bold with calling that out, both in private and in public.
So it's just been building up for the last 10 years, and then this is we're intersecting the story at which it comes to a head, I guess. So okay, there's a moment where they walk out of the room, and there's this like trail of blood coming out of the Queen's chambers that's just very vivid. So Cristen kind of gives this look to Laenor like, sup. You know, I don't know if you saw that, but it was like a really...
I murdered your lover in plain sight 10 years ago. Want to stare at me some more, King Consort? Yeah, that was dark. Yeah, a literal trail of blood going from Alicent and Cristen to Laenor and Rhaenyra in this shot, and like understanding that then everybody else in the court is going to probably see that, like has been seeing that Rhaenyra is literally like bleeding out of her vagina right after she gave birth because the queen really needed to see that fresh baby. Not a good look, Alicent.
Yeah, I think there's a big question of who people are rooting for after this episode, and a lot of people seem to be rooting for Rhaenyra. I'm gonna say I'm standing Alicent, but we'll get into that probably later on. We can maybe do that, make that part of our ending of this episode. So then we cut to the dragon pit where we see kids playing with each other. Now, as I was watching this episode, I was really confused about who the heck these kids were, what their names were, what their relationships were to each other. Kim Renfro, please break it all down for us.
Yeah. So let's start with Rhaenyra's boys. So Rhaenyra has 3 sons, obviously the newborn Joffrey in this episode, but her older boys, the oldest is Jacaerys, which they call him Jace. That's like his nickname. So Jace is oldest kid, little mop of brown hair, cute boy. And then her middle son is Lucerys, who they call Luke, is like his nickname. So Jace and Luke are oldest and second oldest children of Rhaenyra, and to the realm, Laenor, but really we know that those children were born from her having sex with Harwin Strong outside of marriage. And then Alicent's kids are all blonde. So Alicent's children are the 3 blonde-headed kids. She has an oldest boy, Aegon II, which we saw baby Aegon like in the boar hunt and everything. So that baby has now grown up to be like the long-haired sort of like...
He's the kid who's a piece of shit, basically, right?
Yeah. He's
okay.
the kid who was jerking off in the window.
Yeah.
And like leading the charge to bully everyone. So he's the oldest out of all of them, right? Because we saw that Alicent had her children long before Rhaenyra. And then Alicent's second child is Helena, the girl. She's the middle child. So that was
she's the one that was fascinated by the centipede or the millipede or whatever, right?
Yeah. Sort of just seems to be like keeping to herself. And then Alicent's youngest is Aemond. So Aemond.
Great.
Aemond, Targaryen is the little one who was being bullied, and like they gave him a pig, and then he went and sort of like snuck in the recesses of the dragon pit because he has not yet bonded to a dragon.
Yeah, so Rhaenyra's children are all brown-haired,
and
Alicent's children are blonde. And that's confusing to me because there's one person in each couple that is not blonde. And so I was like, so one of the pairings is all blonde and one of them is not. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah. What is interesting is that Rhaenyra, she says it later, but like Rhaenyra is right that what matters, at least in terms of like dragon riding and everything, is that her boys are hers. So they are Targaryens, even if they don't look like Targaryens. And that is why they have been able to bond with dragons. It doesn't matter that their father isn't Laenor. All that matters is that their mother is Rhaenyra.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to... This is going to be a long walk, Kim, so here we go.
All right.
Laenor names him and Rhaenyra's third child, Joffrey, after the guy that was murdered in last episode.
Yes.
At the time that he says his name is Joffrey, I don't think we knew. Like at the time that Laenor says, I want to call him Joffrey, we had not yet met the other kids that Rhaenyra had.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't think, right?
No, I think you're right.
I was like, oh, Joffrey, that makes sense. Then we meet his other kids, and it's like, well, why is Joffrey the third kid? And it reminded me of this moment in Back to the Future 1. Have you seen Back to the Future 1, Kim?
Yes.
Awesome movie. And basically, Marty McFly goes back in time, solves a lot of his parents' problems, and then goes forward in time. And there's a moment at the end where Marty's mom, the younger version of her, says, Marty, what a nice name. And then it's like, oh, yeah, that's why she names him Marty McFly in the future. But Marty's the third kid.
Took her that long to be like...
It took her that long to, you know, like, and so just as that did not make sense, this equally did not make sense to me. Just funny, as like, why is he waiting till the third kid to name it Joffrey? Wouldn't that be the first thing on his mind, fresh out of that wedding from last week? Anyway.
My argument to that is that he knows that her firstborn is heir to the Iron Throne. And I think naming the firstborn after like this scandalous, awful thing that happened, and then having that name be like remembered in the history books, whereas like the younger kids, you know, kind of fall by the wayside sometimes when it comes to...
Okay, but not even the second kid, Kim?
Look, you want me to talk about how insane it is that Harry named his child Albus Severus, like Potter? Like, people... fictional naming is chaotic, you know?
I can agree with that. Okay. Before we move on, just at the Dragon Pit, I was kind of lost about who has a dragon, who doesn't have a dragon, who's supposed to have a dragon. Like, can you break this down for me?
Yeah, so the smaller dragon that we see brought out to the boys in this scene is Vermax. So that's Jace. That's Jace's bonded dragon.
Who is Rhaenyra's firstborn child.
Yes. Yeah. Next in line for the Iron Throne.
Yeah.
So Aegon, they mentioned that Aegon has a dragon named Sunfire, who we don't see in this episode, but is presumably in the pit somewhere. Also, at this point, I believe that Helena has bonded to a dragon, but we haven't seen them mention that. So we'll wait and see what they do with Helena and her dragon riding. And then the sort of tension that arises among this group is the fact that Aemond, who is Alicent's youngest son, has not yet bonded to a dragon.
So Alicent's 2 out of 3 kids have bonded with dragons.
Yes,
right?
not her youngest.
The third youngest one has not done it.
Yeah, and he's the one who sneaks down into the pits, and I'm pretty sure that dragon that he sees, who like spouts fire just like over his head, presumably, I'm pretty sure that's this dragon named Dreamfire. That's interesting. I saw some people point this out on Twitter that in Game of Thrones, there's like a question of where did Dany's dragon eggs come from? Like what dragon laid those eggs and then they were turned to stone for centuries or whatever. There's been, I think, like a theory or some slight clues that Dreamfire is the dragon who had a clutch of eggs and that those eggs eventually became Dany Targaryen's 3 dragons. And someone pointed out that like the design of that dragon looks a lot like Drogon. We've talked about how each of the dragons kind of has like slightly different body type or coloring or whatever. And in that little clip that we saw in the dragon pit, I'm pretty sure that was Dreamfire, and it's sort of like a little visual cue to the future. This is like the ancestor of Dany's dragons, possibly.
I've been trying to nitpick this episode, but what I'm about to say is not a nitpick. I'm just expressing a desire, which is I wish we had more about like understanding of how these dragons worked from a logistical perspective. We get to see this dragon pit; it's super cool, but it's like the amount of food necessary to feed one dragon alone must be massive. So, are there just people like raising herds of sheep and cattle just to feed dragons? And where does all the dragon poop go? You know, like that's a huge. When they're shooting like the Battle of the Bastards in real life for Game of Thrones, it's like one of the big issues they had to deal with was all the horse poop. That they had a whole plan to deal with that poop, and it's like, what happens? What happens with all this dragon poop and the food and all this stuff? I'm so curious about it, and I don't think we're ever going to get those answers, and that's completely fine. But it is what questions are stirred up for me when I watch the show.
Reminded me of seeing the goat placed in like the T-Rex pen in Jurassic Park, right?
Yes.
Where it's like obviously this T-Rex needs more than a single dragon or a single goat a day. But that's like the dramatic scene that we get.
Also, the T-Rex wants to hunt, Kim Renfro. The T-Rex wants to hunt.
True.
Sure, it eats the goat later, but anyway. Okay. We meet these kids one by one. Alicent has a conversation with Helena, who's really into her hobbies. I guess she's an entomologist. And she's really into it. She's not even clocking this massive fight that Alicent is having with Aemond, because Alicent is upbraiding Aemond for going down into the dangerous dragon pit part, and that's when Alicent gives him a stern talking to.
Yeah, it's interesting that she seemed like she says like your obsession with those beasts. Once again, kind of letting us know that Alicent is not down with the Targaryen traditional ways. Like, she seems to not want her children to care very much about dragons, whereas Rhaenyra and, Daemon, Laena, all of those are of the generation of Targaryens and Valerians who very much like cherish the fact that their children get to be dragon riders.
This whole sequence is basically Alicent meeting a bunch of different people, and you kind of learn what the state of her relationships is with them at this point, right? She has a meeting with Viserys, who she expresses her dissatisfaction to him about the fact that Rhaenyra is clearly having children with somebody who's not her husband, and Viserys is like, "Hey, these are just rumors. How could you possibly think they'd be true? Also, if they were true, it would really complicate Rhaenyra's claim to the throne at this time." So Alicent meets Cristen, and we get a little conversation with them. They're just kind of venting to each other, and Cristen goes a little bit too far with his venting, don't you think?
I really liked seeing this dynamic play out, because it's like we're watching the two different ways in which like misogyny rears its head within like either like a woman or a man. So Alicent is like has completely internalized this idea that like if you're a woman in Westeros, you do your duty, you don't complain about it, and like you maintain the status quo in the realm or whatever. And the fact that Rhaenyra is not doing that seems to like piss her off to no end. And then Cristen is like has like gotten so bitter about Rhaenyra and her position. And it's interesting to watch the line that Alicent needs drawn. Like, okay, we can complain all day about her being a liar and her not being decent, but like, oh, don't you dare use the C word, because then it's like Alicent's trying to be like, when they go low, we go high, except like like not at the same time. So yeah, it's like Cristen is still expected to like maintain some sort of decorum. And yeah, I highlighted that quote that Alicent says, because I think of all the things that she says in this episode, what seems to really translate to me to like her personality is when she says, I have to believe that in the end, honor and decency will prevail. We need to hew to that and to each other. So like she's trying to like form this alliance based on a shared understanding of honor and decency. And yet I don't think that her and Cristen are always acting honorable and decent. It's just like, what is their standard for that? Like Alicent walking in, and like then of course they cut straight from that line to the introduction of what Aegon Targaryen II does on his own free time, which is apparently stand in the window and jerk off to like the sound of the sept bells chiming. And like Alicent comes into that room and doesn't give him a lecture about behaving with honor and decency. Like she acts like this is a thing that happens all the time. Like, yeah, my teenage son has just been being a little menace everywhere. And instead she she just like yells at him about his potential claim to the Iron Throne. And the fact that he does not seem to care at all. I'm like, Alicent, what have you been doing for the last 10 years of this teenage boy's life? Like,
if only we had some insight into that, Kim. If only
fair.
we had some insight into it.
But it's almost like it's not like I need to, like, all that I needed to know is that Alicent is parenting her children in private in a different way than she's expecting them to behave in public. And that's where, like, that's why Aegon comes off as such a little shit, right? Like, Alicent even says something to the extent of, like, you can bully your little brother all you want one-on-one, but don't do it in front of other people. Like, that's a weird lesson to be teaching your kid. And it just lets me know that, like, Alicent is operating from a space of, like, anger, and so is Cristen. Whereas, like, Rhaenyra seems to be operating from a place of, like, I just want to do what I want because that should be my birthright as the heir to the Iron Throne.
Yeah.
And her kids, like Jace and Luke, seem pretty sweet and, like, mild-mannered. And yes, they do kind of bully up on Aemond, but that was totally Aegon's. Like, Aegon's the little ringleader.
Yeah.
And Jace and Luke seem to be a little bit more like, we're just living our lives as princes, you know?
Classic Kim Renfro impression, as usual. The only other thing I want to call out is Sir Criston Cole saying, quote, "The Princess Rhaenyra is brazen and relentless, a spider who stings and sucks her prey dry," end quote. First of all, to quote Archer, phrasing. Secondly, I do think, like, this shows that there's a lot of shame, right? Like, he still has a lot of shame connected with him being with her that one night, and, like, he's clearly swung all the way in the other direction on Rhaenyra at this point.
Right.
So.
And because, like, Alicent is his savior. And I'm sure it's almost like he's, like, a born-again Christian who now, like, hates the fact that he was ever tempted into sin by, like, another person. And, like,
100%.
We've talked extensively about the very gray area dynamics of that sex scene between Rhaenyra and Cristen. But the way that the actors talk about it, the actual sexual act was consensual and that they were happy in those little moments together, and then basically, like, it all went to crap afterwards because of their differing beliefs in what is an appropriate way to behave if you are a sworn Kingsguard and a princess.
We cut to Daemon and Laena. Where are they at this point? They're from Pentos?
They're in right? Pentos, that's the same place where Dany and Viserys were at the start of Game of Thrones with...
I think you're thinking of Illyrio Mopatis?
Yes. Illyrio Mopatis was also in Pentos, like, hosting the Targaryens. So it's almost like we get the sense that this is a thing that people in Essos still do, and that, like, that they were doing this in Daemon's era, and that in the future there will still be people in Pentos who are happy to have a Targaryen guest at their manse or whatever. So yes, they're in Pentos, which is in Essos.
My interpretation was that, like, the events that we are seeing, I don't know the future, you know, you will know more than me, but my interpretation was that the events we see in this episode help to pave the way for Dany still having, quote unquote, some friends in Pentos.
Yeah.
You know, that maybe because of the stuff that Daemon does, she's still welcome in Pentos despite all the stuff that's happened to the Targaryen household. So
yeah,
and we'll see if it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Daemon is on Caraxes. Laena is flying on Vhagar. They have a little dance with dragons, as it were, and it's fine. You know, I'm like, who? the CG is fine. I'm like, who? I don't even know who this character is. What is cool is you see her, Laena's saddle looks a little bit different than Viserys's, and Daemon's, I should say, and that's kind of cool. That, like, she is still Targaryen, like, has Targaryen blood in her, but because she is of the house of Lord Corlys, they would have, like, a different way of, like, constructing a saddle than a regular Targaryen might. So
I also took that just to be the fact that Vhagar, who's the dragon that Laena's riding, is massive, like, way bigger than Caraxes. So, like, the fact that they would have to figure out a slightly different rig to get around this, like, huge bulk of a dragon with Vhagar made sense to me. So yeah, Vhagar is one of the original 3 dragons that the Targaryens had when they were conquering Westeros. So Visenya, who was Aegon the Conqueror's sister / wife, was the writer of Vhagar. We heard Laena ask specifically about Vhagar, remember, when she was 12 and having that conversation with King Viserys? Like, when she was asking about, oh, well, like, when's the last time anyone saw that dragon? That was Vhagar. And so it's like, we've jumped ahead of time. And yeah, I guess if there was one thing that I would like to see if we hadn't done the time jump, it would have been Laena actually getting like bonding with Vhagar and the sort of like establishment of that bond, because as we see by the end of the episode, it's a very pivotal relationship.
Yeah, or any character development for Laena whatsoever prior to now would have been awesome to see. You know, that would have been great to get us to invest in this character that's killed.
I think we got a little bit.
A little bit. That's a tiny bit.
There were crumbs. There were crumbs in the other episodes. Okay, you know, a lot of spinning plates. Just saying.
So, as you indicated, Daemon is being. So here's the thing: Daemon is a completely different character than when we last left off. Right? The Daemon that we saw 10 years ago was. Hothead, loose cannon, like would go rogue. Now he's really chilled out. He's really mellowed out. And as you put it in our weekly Twitter space, he had a hard 20s and now he's in his 30s and really thinking about his life, right? Like,
yeah,
he really hit it hard in his 20s, and he's like, dude, if I'm gonna live to 40, I need to really settle down. So, you know. If one was not a fan of the time jump, one might say, wow, that's pretty rough that this character you've been built up as having basically a couple characteristics, of which one is he is a hothead. Now we cut forward and he's a completely different dude. We don't even know what is motivating him at this point. One could regard that as a weakness of this episode. But
I recognize the big feelings you're having here. We're gonna keep holding space for them.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you so much. But anyway, yeah. So he is now chilled out, and this lord in Pentos is saying, "Hey, you've got dragons, we've got land and money. I'm gonna gift you a whole mansion. You can live out your days here." And I guess the idea is that because the dragons are with Daemon and Laena, that the dragons will like occupy the space and theoretically be able to help defend it.
Yeah.
From like a triarchy uprising or whatever. Is that kind of
or anything like any type of unrest? I think that we are just getting the vibe that there's at least one, if not several, like lords in Pentos who would be happy to have Daemon and Laena on as like their permanent security, like guests, effectively, right? Because it's like, it's, as we've said before, it's like having a nuclear weapon. So it's like, of course, they would like to continue hosting this power in Essos, in Pentos, to like shield them from anybody deciding that it's time to try and go after the goods there. I
think this development is also discussed in the small council meeting. Is that right? Did I recall that correctly? But anyway.
Yeah, they bring up like the triarchy again. That like
and
new
they remark
people.
on how Daemon is like not defending them anymore, and there's a debate about who should be defending them. But Daemon's kind of, he has really removed himself from the chessboard, it seems like, at this point in time.
Yeah, and
despite literally everything we saw until now, he's removed himself from the chessboard. But okay, go ahead. What were you saying?
I went back and I was like trying to find what part of Fire and Blood might allude to or like further enlighten our understanding of like this shift with Daemon. And the quote that I saw, which I think is kind of getting at it, says, quote, "Prince Daemon fell in love with Laena, the singers would have us believe. Men of a more cynical bent believe the prince saw her as a way to check his own descent. Once seen as his brother's heir, he had fallen far down in the line of succession, and neither the Greens nor the Blacks had a place for him," unquote. So the Greens are like Alicent's, like Alicent loyalists, basically, and the Blacks are Rhaenyra's loyalties. So I think reading this, I was like, okay, thinking about the last time we saw him was at the wedding. I think that he kind of was trying to make the big swing at marrying Rhaenyra in the earlier episodes and in his little hot-headed 20s, where like he was really pushing Viserys's buttons. His arrival at the wedding, like he was allowed to sit there, but, he was being confronted about murdering his first wife. And then this other murder happens. And like, as the chaos breaks out, I can believe, with this added background from Fire and Blood, that Daemon saw everything go down in episode 5 and was like, okay, I no longer really have a strong play here. Like, Alicent and Viserys are clearly like doing their own thing. Rhaenyra and Laenor got married in like a shotgun wedding after that ceremony. So like, what could he possibly do? I guess marrying the beautiful young woman who was flirting with him at the party, who also loves dragons, isn't a really bad life for him for a few years. And so like, that's what we skipped with this time jump, is him sort of coming to that decision. Instead, we're just seeing him in the like slightly more domestic, chilled out environment. But Laena does note something about him like obsessing over the books. And so that's interesting to me. It's almost like he's been hanging out in Essos, where in theory there are more archives relating to the Valyrian, like relating to Valyria and dragon writing and magic and stuff that he might not have had access to in Westeros. So it's like he's like,
biding his time.
He went to dragon grad school in Essos for like 8 years and had a family.
Yeah. And still sort of, when no one is looking, he has his eyes on the Iron Throne, I would say, right? Like, he's still thinking like, maybe one day,
Maybe. And also, I think that this episode takes us, I think that you pointed this out maybe in our quick chat last night, but that like by the end of the episode, now both Rhaenyra and Daemon have lost the two people that mattered, or like the two people that knew them most intimately at this stage of their lives.
Yes. In the we do not talk about what is on the next time on preview for House of the Dragon, but I did watch the behind the episode, and they did point out that in this episode, both Rhaenyra and Daemon lose a character that has been very grounding and supportive for them. To which my response is, that's news to me. Because we barely got to know these people. Okay, all right. So let's finish off the Daemon storyline, right?
Okay.
Daemon and Laena have a conversation where they kind of help to explain what has happened with Daemon in the time since the last episode. I saw some people say, hey, what would be really helpful for these time jumps is if you just effing told us how much time had passed. Like, that would actually help people, because what instead is happening is people are needing to spend a lot of time figuring it out. I don't know. I didn't really have a big problem with it, but I did want to just call that out as well, that like some people were like, oh, hey, maybe help us out with the time jumps instead of like letting us like pick up the pieces or pick up the crumbs of information in each episode.
I just imagine like a SpongeBob title card that's like 10 years
10 years later. Yeah, exactly. But Lena's pregnant. Laena has is talking with her child Baela at one point, and Baela's trying to get her dragon egg to hatch, and Laena says, by the way, not all dragon eggs hatch. Is that right?
Yeah, which I guess is true. I also have more questions about like, how long are you supposed to wait? Is there some sort of ceremony? Like, Baela seems to just be like holding the egg near the fire to like keep it warm. Which we've seen them have those like little, dragon pots with coals walking around. But yeah, I don't know what the holdup is at this stage for that egg. I'm not sure what's going on.
We also get a sense that Daemon doesn't really love his children or is super attentive to them, Baela says like, yeah, dad doesn't talk to me at all. So it's like, wonder what's going on there.
Yeah.
We later see Laena go into labor, and she is unable to have the child, and Daemon's there watching, and he is presented with the same dilemma as Viserys was in episode 1. Should they try to save the child, but it might mean the mother is dead?
It will mean
the mother's dead.
Yeah. Or like, mom's dying either way. We can try this one thing to save the baby, but that'll definitely kill mom, right?
Yeah, and I like the concept behind the scene. I'm not sure I love the execution, because it's a big moment. It should be a big moment for both of them, right? It should be a big moment of like Daemon saying like, no, I'm not doing that. Like, Laena gets to have a say. Instead, I think you had pointed out he basically kind of just like shakes his head a little bit and like that's it. And it's like, okay, that feels like a little weak to me in terms of. And then the next thing we know, Lena's out there getting torched by the dragon. It just from an editing perspective, it felt weird.
She
for
moved
what was supposed
fast.
to be. Yeah, exactly. For what was supposed to be like a really big moment,
Yeah,
it felt pretty weird. That said, pretty badass moment when she gets the dragon to like Dracarys her. Like that was awesome. But
yeah, and like Vhagar, like kind of like hesitating a little bit at first. Like,
yes,
what do you mean, Mom? I don't fire you.
amazing dragon impression, kid.
Thanks.
But yeah, and it's like, okay, yeah, she went out like a complete badass. Wish I had gotten to know that character a little bit better, but
yeah,
it is a great kind of visual of her going out at the end, and obviously a very marked difference to how Emma went out in the first episode. So
right, it's entirely her choice and as she wants it. Still very tragic. But also there's the difference here in the decision to be made is that like succession wasn't on the line for them. Like Daemon saying no was both like great that you're not picking that, but also he maybe had less weight on him to try and like definitely make sure that baby survives. Because in Viserys and Emma's case, it was like, we need an heir and we need him 3 years ago, whereas Laena and Daemon are not in that situation.
That's basically it when it comes to the Daemon storyline. There's a scene at sunrise when Daemon is kind of spending time with his kids as they're, bereft over the loss of their mom.
Yeah. We see that he doesn't know how to comfort them.
Yeah.
Which is sad. So. Yeah.
But that is the Daemon update for this episode. Lots more stuff happening with Rhaenyra and Alicent. There is this great training sequence with Cristen and Sir Harwin, and they're in the yard, and Viserys is like, love it when the fellas get to do a little training. This is just like in the olden days, And of course, there's all these resentments because Sir Harwin is really protective over his children, and Sir Cristen taunts him at one point and is like, hey, wow, you're really concerned. It'd be the same concern that someone would show for a cousin or a brother or a son. Just throwing out 3 random family relationships for you. There's no reason I chose those specific 3 in any way. And that, of course, prompts Sir Harwin to attack Sir Cristen. And I thought this is a pretty well done sequence, and you kind of get the sense of all the resentment between them. Sir Cristen doesn't like that there's all these bastard children. Obviously, it goes against the sense of decency, and also it's like with his ex, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's good stuff. Anything you want to point out about this scene?
Just, you already kind of said it, but like Viserys watching was just so interesting to me because like he seems to know that Aegon is kind of being a little shit and like tries to kind of chime in, but he's just so ineffective at this point. Like no one's really paying that much attention to his feelings. We don't see Viserys have a single conversation with any of his new children or grandchildren, even though they're all around the same age. But those are like Rhaenyra's half brothers and then also Viserys's sons. It's just like we've seen these sort of training sequences before with like Jon Snow or at Winterfell or with Joffrey, King Joffrey, like little King Joffrey, not baby Joffrey. So many names that are all kind of the same.
Not baby Joffrey or the Joffrey that got murdered last episode. Yeah.
No. A third Joffrey.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was a good scene. I think that the parallels between Cristen getting beat up by Harwin and Joffrey getting beat up by Cristen were really interesting. The fact that like assaulting a Kingsguard is enough to get you, banished from the castle, whereas a Kingsguard murdering a person is chill and fine because he has an advocate in Alicent, whereas Harwin, it's almost like Rhaenyra can't really like stand up for him too much because then that would just be like worsening the problem, so he kind of gets hung out to dry and then toasted, but we'll get to that probably.
Rhaenyra escapes out of her secret doorway, and it's not really clear exactly what she's doing. Is she going to listen in on this conversation between the Hand of the King and his son? Unclear, but either way, she overhears it. You hear Lionel Strong is the name of the Hand of the King.
Yes.
Talking to his son, a.k.a. Rhaenyra's
lover.
baby daddy.
Yeah.
About how, hey, you've really put us in a really terrible situation, especially with this latest attack on Sir Cristen. You've really upped to the level of the rumors to an unsustainable degree here, and so they clearly need to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
Rhaenyra has an extended conversation with Laenor. We see Laenor has his buddy with him, Carl with a Q.
It's like my favorite spelling of a Westeros.
Carl with a Q.
Carl. It's just Carl.
Yeah, just Carl. Just Carl. And
Quarrel.
They talk about what they're going to do, and Laenor wants to go back out to sea to kind of fight this battle against, I think it's the Triarchy at this point, or who's he fighting against?
Some Tyroshi, like a Tyroshi pirate is mentioned, which might be just a new iteration of the new
crab feeder.
Yeah.
I guess they couldn't introduce the crab feeder in episode 1 and then have him still be like a plausible villain 15 years later after episode 1, I guess, but it would have been I don't think it would have worked on a storytelling perspective to be like, what was he doing these 15 years,
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like the show is not willing to take other chances. Anyway, they talk about whether or not he should leave, and Rhaenyra is really opposed to him departing because she needs backup at this very critical time when all these rumors are spreading and her claim to the throne might be in jeopardy. Right.
Mm-hmm. It was
also
interesting.
We learned that Laenor and his whole family love using storm and ship analogies to inform their behavior. Right. Anyway, go ahead.
I was going to say real fast before the Laenor ship analogy, I just think it's interesting that Rhaenyra, even in this conversation, won't say out loud, like, yeah, those children are Sir Harwin's. And I almost wondered if she feels like she might be being spied upon still, like even inside her own bedroom, because like she seems to still use euphemisms and kind of like shut him down when he tries to get at like, well, they're not wrong or whatever. But yeah, Laenor like sort of quotes what Corlys said. So Laenor tells Rhaenyra, the wise sailor flees the storm as it gathers. Back in episode 2, which was like 13 years ago in this timeline, when Viserys and Corlys were having a discussion about potentially betrothing Laena to Viserys, Corlys told him, quote, to elude a storm, you can either sail into it or around it, but you must never await its coming, end quote. But I'm also like, Laenor's telling her to flee. He's not saying, hey, go around the storm, let's figure out like what our next move is. They both seem to be kind of in just like full flight mode, which I don't think is what Corlys meant when he said that quote to Viserys. He was more being like,
well, I think that would be they're trying to sail around the storm, I think, in this case. But
okay, that's a fair read.
Laenor is willing to stay, I think, is my sense, but he's really unhappy about it. And then we get a small council meeting, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on at the small council meeting that's
so much,
really different and a little bit confusing to me. I will say that Alicent is sitting at the small. She has a seat at the table now, which is different than it was before, right?
For sure.
And so we can. Again, this is a thing where I don't mind filling in the blanks of like, okay, it's not a major like you don't need to have a scene where King Viserys is like, hey, I'd like to invite you to the small council. You have some good input. I'd like, like you can kind of just assume that stuff happened that led to her getting to the small council meeting. Like that's not like an interesting scene that would have added so much to our understanding of the show. I don't mind all time jumpy stuff, but there's other things about important moments between characters and character development that I do mind missing out on.
Mm-hmm.
Kim Renfro, what are the biggest developments, new pieces of information that were dropped at this small council meeting?
Yeah, so much is going on. First, what I noticed is that we now have a new Grand Maester at the table. His name is Orwyl. Maester Orwyl, spelled Orywle. He's the guy who was like the assistant to the previous Grand Maester, and we saw him a couple of times trying to like recommend alternative methods of helping Viserys. Like in the very first episode, he's the one who suggests cauterizing the wound, I believe. And then he like mixed up a brand new poultice, and then like the Maester was ignoring him. But now in this time jump, that maester has died. We've got a new maester at the table. And I think that that's supposed to be like our deep background understanding of how Viserys has survived for as long as he did, given that he was so messed up at the end of episode 5. Like, he died like 3 times in that episode. But he's still here. And I think that you can credit that to the fact that now he has a new maester who has a better understanding of how to prevent whatever is ailing Viserys from getting worse. So like there's that. They mention as we enter the scene, they are talking about a dispute between the Blackwoods and the Brackens. And you'll remember from episode 3 when Rhaenyra was like hosting her little, or was that 4? Jesus. Yeah. 3 was the hunt. So yeah, 4 was when she was entertaining all of the potential suitors. And we had those 2 young men wind up fighting to the death. Those were the Brackens and the Blackwoods. So we get this hint that like those families are still at each other's throats 10 years later. In Fire and Blood, they say that the rivalry between these 2 houses even predates the Targaryen conquest. So it's like a long running thing. Rhaenyra, of course, knows that like she's the one who says, quote, they will use any excuse to spill each other's blood. Like, she knows that firsthand because she was there when she saw the 2 of them fight to the death over like basically nothing, over just some barbs that were being exchanged. Mm-hmm. We also get a mention of Lord Grover. I don't know if you caught that. That is straight up a like Sesame Street reference.
Wow.
They didn't go so far as to mention his Lord Grover's successors, but there absolutely are characters named Elmo and Kermit in Fire and Blood that are descendants of Lord Grover Tully. So that's fun. We might get an Elmo name drop in future episodes if they keep this thread up.
So these are kind of side stories that may become important later, but are basically book references, lore stuff that's fleshed out better in the books. The main thrust of this meeting is that Rhaenyra makes this apology to Alicent and makes an offer to her, right? Mm-hmm. She offers that her son, Jacaerys, a.k.a. Jace, will marry Alicent's daughter, Helena. Mm-hmm. And Viserys is like, this is wonderful. Of course, everyone's loving, happy family. Mm-hmm. And I think Alicent just says, hey, I'm going to really need to think long and hard about that, you know? And
she doesn't even say that. She just...
she says like, yeah, we will duly consider your offer. Yeah, I think.
Sure. You know? But like Rhaenyra, I think it's a solid speech and move from Rhaenyra, honestly. Like, I think everything that Rhaenyra says in the small council meeting seems to me to be kind of like the right strategy. And the fact that Alicent, instead of like entertaining it, first of all, Alicent refuses to sit back down, which I think was notable. She stays standing, putting herself like on an even keel with Rhaenyra in this moment. But the fact that Alicent is the one who points out that like Rhaenyra has started leaking milk through her dress, just to kind of like Alicent could have easily just like ignored that or like tried to carry on the meeting, but instead Alicent decides that like the best way to shut this down, because she sees that like it's working on Viserys, the other people at the table might also be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Instead of actually entertaining the conversation, she just kind of like tries to put Rhaenyra back a few pegs below her, which is like, I assume that this is the first time in Targaryen, in all of Westerosi history, that a woman who has recently given birth is sitting at the table in the small council. And like, clearly the men of the realm don't, God forbid, we see the evidence of milk coming out of your boobs, like behaving as if it's the craziest thing that they've ever seen. I really felt for Rhaenyra in that scene, and felt really frustrated with Alicent that she's continuing to just like try and knock Rhaenyra down a peg whenever she can.
Mm-hmm. There's a scene afterwards with Alicent and Viserys where they hash out some of their differences. And Viserys kind of is still wanting Alicent to take care of him a little bit. She's really not receptive to that because she knows what's going on. She knows about what's going on with Rhaenyra, and Viserys either does not, cannot, will not, see the truth for what it is. You have a detail here about Viserys in this episode and how he is so wounded and infected by the Iron Throne that he never sat on it again. Is that right?
Yeah, although Yeah. So in Fire and Blood, it says, quote, after the loss of his fingers, Viserys I never sat upon the Iron Throne again. Thereafter, he shunned the throne, preferring to hold court in his solar and later in his bedchamber, surrounded by maesters, septons, and his faithful fool Mushroom. Unquote. And Mushroom, we mentioned last episode, was seen very briefly at the wedding feast, but they don't seem to be including Mushroom as like an actual recurring character. Yeah, it is interesting. I'm not sure that I would have picked up on that, but we really have not seen him sit on the throne in the show since his fingers were amputated. And now everything is just happening between the small council, the courtyard, and his bedroom. I think it just shows that he completely kind of gave up trying to actually rule. I feel like he named Rhaenyra as heir, tried to shore up the family with as many marriages and baby producing situations as possible. And then he's just like, all right, I'm hands off now. I'm going to pretend to not see what everybody else around me sees going on with my line of succession with like Rhaenyra's children. And I'm going to choose not to see that my wife and her ex-best friend / my daughter are like at each other's throats nonstop. He just sort of is like fully in this very passive mode of rule. And that's to everybody else's detriment, I think.
Sir Lionel Strong comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He has a confession to make. I do think it's interesting to see the contrast between this scene and also Otto Hightower doing a similar thing. Lionel Strong is smart enough to not actually say the thing. You know, the king, the queen, they're like, hey, please speak plainly. Like, let's just say what it is. And he refuses to do it. I'm like, this is a smart hand. And of course, Viserys acknowledges that by saying, you have served me faithfully for 10 years without any, negative things happening at all. I'm like, well, okay, I guess that explains that. But everything I've seen of Lionel Strong has been great. Like, he does seem like a smart, cool dude that is trying to do right by the king.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this, of course, further incenses Alicent, who feels like the evidence is now overwhelming about Rhaenyra's children, right?
And I'm sure that she's like, we see her parroting things that Otto told her, right? Like when she kind of snaps at Aegon, she's effectively echoing what her dad told, like what her dad scared into her when she was a teenager at the start of episode 5. And yeah, she sees so plainly Viserys treating this hand slightly differently than her father. And she's so much more.
Viserys throws shade at her father. He's like, "You've basically been the best hand I've ever had." Right in front of Alicent. I'm like, "Ooh, that's cold blooded, dude."
Yeah,
but yeah, Sir Strong wants to resign, and because he will not say the terrible thing, Viserys is like, "Well, then I don't accept your resignation." And then he's like, "Okay, fine. I'll continue to be king. Continue to be hand of the king, but I'm going to escort my son back to Harrenhal, where he's going to just chill until he is to take my place." Mm-hmm. So then the king's like, fine, whatever. At that point, Alicent and Larys have a conversation. They have like a private dinner in her bedroom, and it's clear that these have been going on for quite some time, probably since the last episode. So maybe it's been going on for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Larys thinks Sir Lionel is too attached to honor, and Alicent is really pissed that there's no one on her side in this case, and her father would be on her side if he were around. Larys interprets this as an order to go put her father back into power. He goes down to these cells. He recruits these dudes. He says, hey, you can get your freedom if you agree to, A, cut off your tongues and B, assassinate this person. Not sure why the tongue thing was necessary, feels like it would have made... I guess the idea is that, okay, you can't tell anyone who helped me. But, I guess these guys are also illiterate. They can't write. I guess they can't point either, to to anyone. Like what's the point of cutting off the tongues other than it's extremely graphic and brutal?
They definitely probably can't write within the world, the realm of Westeros, right? Like reading and writing was something reserved for highborn children to learn.
But they don't have a police lineup in Westeros. Like, hey, who among these people put you up to it? Can you point to them? Also, it feels like it would have made the mission really hard to do. Because if they can't literally can't talk to each other, but anyway, I'm not a mastermind statist or a strategist like Larys, So like he obviously knows things I don't.
Yeah, I mean Larys is just being our Littlefinger, right? Mm-hmm. Of like he has access and strategies to sort of the underbelly of King's Landing, and he uses that to his advantage to further his own political cause. I sort of saw this less as like, oh, he definitely thinks that was an order from Alicent, more as like, here's my opportunity.
Yes.
To further my station, kill my dad and brother, who apparently have a sociopathic relationship to and just don't care about. Yeah. And all at the same time have something to hang over Alicent's head now.
Further, yeah, I was being a little facetious, so I apologize if that didn't come across.
That's fine.
I don't think he really interpreted it as an order. Like he's an opportunist. He sees an opportunist to further intertwine his fate with Alicent, and make this basically it's a win-win-win for Sir Larys or Larys Strong, not Sir. So we see Lionel Strong and bring his son back. Harwin and Rhaenyra have like a fairly emotional goodbye. Again, I barely know this relationship, so didn't really feel that much about it. But it's like I feel that the show thinks I'm supposed to feel something for it. And then he leaves and comes back. He leaves and goes away. And then I think Rhaenyra's son asks her, "Hey, am I a bastard child? Like, is that really my dad?" And she's like, "What's most important is that you're a Targaryen." And I'm like, "Wow, dude, this is really tell him the truth or lie to him, but this is some terrible in between path, in my opinion."
Yeah, she does really dodge that one.
Yeah.
And she looks around to make sure that like her youngest or that Luke isn't really listening. So at this point it's like Jace knows the truth. And she does a terrible job of trying to make him believe otherwise. Yeah.
Lionel Strong and actually, before we finish that off, let's talk about Rhaenyra's decision. Right, she and Laenor say, "Hey, we're gonna leave. We're gonna go to get away from here. Dragonstone, I think, is where they go to. Right?
Yep.
And she says, "Hey, Laenor, bring your side piece along. We're gonna need all the help we can get." And they show up there. And my wife watching this was very moved that this is like a truly blended family that we're watching show up, right? We're watching Rhaenyra with her children from this other dude that's now dead. We're watching her show up with her husband, who is gay or bi. I'm not sure exactly what his orientation is. But anyway, he's showing up there with his side piece. And it's like this is like step by step, Westeros edition, if you've watched that TGIF show. Anyway. It's nice, and hopefully this family thrives, in the wars to come.
Yeah, surely nothing bad is happening to anyone ever again in this show. I think that was a really great scene with Rhaenyra being like, you can just tell that her and Laenor do genuinely like support each other, and at the end of the day, they're looking out for one another, and like understand how to pivot from a disagreement into a solution, whereas most of the other couples that we see here don't seem able to get there.
Not very collaborative relationships these couples have, but they do. Okay. Final sequence: Lionel Strong and his son are burned to death. It was kind of an odd staging. You and I talked about it on our Twitter space last night about like, were they in like a suite, like a hotel suite together with like a door in between them, in between their bedrooms, and whatever the case, they couldn't pry them open. They were, jammed shut, we assume. And I believe both of them perish is the implication, because that is why Larys did what he did, was so that Viserys would invite back Otto Hightower to be his hand again.
Yeah. Or that Alicent would at least contact him. He says, like, I assume you will write to your father now. So like at least the window is now open for Otto's return.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this whole sequence? Larys breaking bad and ensnaring Alicent in his machinations?
Yeah, I mean, so in the book, it's unclear what happened to Harwin Strong and Lionel Strong, like the fire in Harrenhal. Basically, like the maester who's writing out Fire and Blood posits like every possible option. So it's like maybe Daemon did it because he was jealous of like Rhaenyra having a new lover. Maybe Larys did it because he had the most to benefit from this or whatever. And then interestingly, that passage concludes with like the darkest implication of all is that King Viserys like had the order done because he would have seen it as an easy way to like eliminate the rumors, I guess, of his line of succession parentage and everything. So to me, I wasn't like shocked that suddenly Larys was like a bad guy. I was more like, oh, they're like going for the full canon explanation that like Larys was the mastermind behind all of this and kind of setting him up to be a more pivotal player in this early stage of the fight between the Greens and the Blacks as they're known, or as they're coming to be known. Yeah, there were so many little like juicy details as Larys was doing his little creepy voiceover. We see Viserys sitting in his room with the ring that was on Queen Emma's hand when she died in childbirth. That's the ring that he kind of puts at the top of his finger and kisses. I'm pretty sure it has a bird on it because one of Emma's parents was from House Arryn. So that's the Vale family, and their little sigil is like a mockingbird, I think. Right? Yeah. We saw another rat win for the rats of the episode. You're never going to escape them, David Chen.
Stop. I am begging you, stop ending episodes with rats.
No, more rats. Team Blood Rat.
Clapping emoji on Twitter is what I'm trying to do.
And I'm #BloodRat on Twitter. Everyone post your favorite blood rats in cinema. Yeah, and like what I think maybe had the hardest time understanding was like Alicent's reaction. It wasn't super difficult for me to understand, but I was just like, oh, she like really was being naive about how much Larys was like dipping his hand in the murder plots.
It's almost like she learned nothing in the prior 10 years about Larys. You know, it's almost like and here, I'm going to read a comment from decodingtv.com. This comes in from Tyler. And I'm just going to say, folks, thank you. If you're listening this far on the podcast, thank you so much for putting up with my complaining. I really appreciate it. I know it's been hard. And if you've come with me this far, I'm going to ask you to go with me just a little bit further. Tyler writes into decodingtv.com. Although I still like this episode, I'm really starting to side with David Chen on the time jumps detracting from my enjoyment. There are two main reasons for why this is the case. The first is I often struggle to suspend my disbelief that seemingly nothing critical happened during the time jump. This week, the Larys development is a good example. I don't disagree that the actions and the reaction of Alicent are in line with their characters. I just struggle to believe that Larys has done nothing in the last 10 years to raise any of Alicent's suspicion. The more important issue for me is I feel like the jumps rob us of seeing the character development that gets us to these big plot reveals. Again, using the Larys example, I have no idea if Larys has just been expertly playing Alicent for a decade by hiding his true nature, or if she's just been oblivious this whole time and missing all the clues. I don't want to see her as clueless, but I think that is a valid interpretation of the scene based on the information the show gives us, and to me, that kind of sucks. Jumping past all the development at best makes it hard to connect to the emotion of a scene, like Rhaenyra saying goodbye to Strong, and at worst undermines my opinion of the character, like with Alicent's reaction to Larys, end quote. So, 100% agree with Tyler. Anyway, go ahead.
I think he was being manipulative very clearly in episode 5 when Alicent was still a teenager. Like that whole scene in the Godswood is him entirely planting himself in front of her at a point when she's like at her most vulnerable, right? Like her father has just left. Her father has told her like your life and your children's lives will be forfeit if and when Rhaenyra ascends the throne. And Larys comes in with his little like moon tea machinations and whatever, and I think fully takes advantage of the fact that Alicent is in need of allies. And so my assumption, and like based on like this like little dinner ritual that we see them having and talking about, I feel like Larys has like he's been playing the long game. Again, just the way that like Littlefinger did, right? Like we didn't get a bunch of detail on what Littlefinger was doing prior to Game of Thrones while he was in the realm. We just knew that he was like a little bit shifty, and then like everything really kicks into high gear once you find out more about how involved he was with like King Robert's downfall, with Jon Arryn's downfall, et cetera, et cetera. So like I think Larys is just supposed to be there as the guy who has way more patience and strategy than most other people in the kingdom. And so he's been endearing himself to Alicent all this time and becoming one of the only people that she will speak with plainly. And now he has her basically caught in a trap of like, sucks for you that you decided to ally yourself with me all those years ago, because turns out I'm a murderer who may or may not be spying on people with rats.
I think I've done a really poor job of explaining my beef with this Larys plot, because I've tried to say it a few times to you and online.
And I'm just like not reading.
Every time I get a response, not just from you, but like from other people on Decoding TV, that feels like it is not addressing or even engaging with what I'm trying to say. So I'm going to try one. I'm going to try one more time. No, it's okay. It's not your fault.
And I'm gonna repeat it back to you what I think you're saying. Let's do this.
It's okay. We're like in relationship counseling here. No, it's okay.
We are.
Let me just try one last time, because I'm saying this is on me. This is on me. This is not on you. Like, this is on me that like I'm not doing a good job of explaining it. But like, I think the issue with the Sir Larys turn is we see how Alicent receives this information. She is stunned. She is like gobsmacked. Like, oh my, I couldn't even have possibly conceived that you might even ever do this. The reason the Littlefinger comparison doesn't work for me is people knew Littlefinger was freaking sketchy in the show. Like, and so the idea is, in order for you to believe that Alicent would be this shocked, you need to believe one of two things. Either Larys is incredibly good at covering up his sketchiness, which even in last episode, I'd argue he wasn't. So maybe he could have gotten better at it, but like he wasn't good at it back then. I don't think he is today, but whatever. Or Alicent is just so oblivious that she didn't pick up on any of his sketchiness in the previous decade. I mean, Kim, you and I have been working together for 10 weeks, and I'm already picking up on your sketchiness over certain topics. So the idea that 10 years, I'm being facetious. Kim has no sketchiness around her.
I'm racking my brain. What did I say?
But I think that it opens up a lot of questions that I don't think the show's ready to answer yet. Maybe it will, about what was the Alicent-Larys relationship like these last 10 years?
Yeah.
Either way, it's not satisfying storytelling. Like, a character who we have seen literally speak maybe 10 lines prior to now suddenly breaks bad. And it's like, okay, great. But in order for me to feel like there's any impact, that we need to see him in other contexts. Really good example. Like, let's go back to the Littlefinger example. When he betrays Ned in season 1, that is like a legitimately like badass moment, because we've seen him being like, we've seen him in multiple different contexts throughout the course of that season. He's
right, like one-on-one with Cersei, one-on-one with Varys, one-on-one with
and like kind of being nice to everyone, ingratiating himself with all these different parties, so that when he finally turns, it is genuinely a shock. It's like, I suspected he could be sketchy, but he finally turns on Ned. It's like, like that's impactful. Here's a guy who was sketchy from the jump, like even from the first episode, or not the first, but like the second time we saw him in the Godswood. He's like, this guy clearly loves the drama, like he's doing.
Yeah, he has an agenda.
And then so for him to break bad, it's like, okay, A, that's not that big of a surprise. B, my opinion of Alicent goes down because she thinks it's a surprise. It's just rough storytelling, and I think a huge part of it is the time jump, and a part of it is just like, even without the time jump, like I think you would have had to show Larys in all these different scenarios for this to be the shock that I think the show wants it to be. Okay.
Yeah.
I have tried my best. I just want to make 100% clear. I have no opposition to Larys breaking bad suddenly. I have no opposition to Larys breaking bad slowly. Like, those are all fine developments, and I'm fine with like being engaged with that journey, enjoying that journey, being shocked when he turns. Like, those are all reasonable reactions I could have. It is the fact that we jump to it so suddenly, after not having any context of what Alicent and Larys' relationship is, or what Larys has been like the last 10 years. That is the issue that I have.
Yeah.
Okay, I've tried my best. Thank you for hearing my case, Judge.
You made great points. I agree that like when I do think more deeply about like the Littlefinger comparison, I would have rather seen one more conversation between Larys and his brother about like You know, like we could have had a very good like Larys threatening Harwin with like outing the secret, or like any number of ways to show him interacting with someone other than Alicent to understand his larger place in court. Because right now he just seems to be a pretty shadowy figure. I'm like,
Yes.
does anybody else even realize that he has such like a private audience with the queen regularly? I don't know.
And this is, again, this goes back to the point about like they should have just started the show at this point in time. Like they should have we could have spent more time with what is Larys's relationship with his
father,
with his dad and brother.
Yeah.
Like
I know.
We know almost nothing about that. And then like for him to turn, it's like, okay, it's completely meaningless to me. So I do think it was a miscalculation for them to start earlier in time, and like they should have just started. They should have, a lot of people have been saying they should have had a whole season with those younger actors. They should have started the season here, and like I think those would have all been legitimate ways to do the show. But the way they've done it, I think, is really taxing people's patience and investment with the show. And we'll see if like it pays off for them. Like we still have 4 episodes left, and we'll see if everyone by the end is like, oh my god, looking back on it, of course they had to do it that way. Like of course.
I'm curious what like the big picture will feel like once we get to the finale,
and also just like the big picture of the fandom of the show too. Like I've been doing this for a long time, Kim. I don't feel like I've seen. Even in the worst of the Game of Thrones days, like until the finale, people were still like, "I'm watching the show until the end," like. But we're getting. I sent you some tweets. We're getting tweets of people being like, "I am done with the show." I'm like, "Whoa, that is a strong reaction even for me, David Chen," and I'm very negative about the time jumps. Like, so I'm curious, like, if like what the implications will, if there's any broader implication for the viewership of the show with this time jump, and if it will in fact actually be a bad storytelling mistake that they made. We don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's going to be like that was a blip in the road, and each episode is going to have like 40 million viewers by the end of the season.
Yeah,
very possible, or not. So that's what I'm curious about. But
yeah, I don't know.
I want to. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Hi, I have a question. It's more of a comment, really. But the last thing that I wanted to like put in context with Alicent, I want to hear from you why you are, in your words, standing Alicent after this episode. Olivia Cook last week spoke with Entertainment Weekly, where she said that Miguel Sapochnik and Ryan Condal, the showrunners, had a conversation with her about Alicent kind of being a woman, like the Westerosi equivalent of a woman who voted for President Donald Trump. And that like fully stuck in my head as I was rewatching this episode, because I think that they're setting her up to be a person who, like, to be a woman, I believe, who is trying to operate within this patriarchal system to her advantage, and then gets like surprised when men burn her. Like, gets a little surprised when Cristen dares to use the C word in conversation regarding another woman. And then in this case, like, seems caught off guard by the fact that Larys would go to such extremes in their seemingly shared political goals, like political achievements in the realm, right? And so that was the last bit of like context that I wanted to float with this whole Alicent Larys situation.
I guess why am I for Alicent 4 now? I haven't seen the whole, where the character evolves. Maybe she's going to take a Dany like turn where she torches everyone. But I guess she's the character I most relate with in the show right now. Like,
how come though? Like, what is it that you find relatable about?
Because she has like she has a code. She has a code, right? And she like is trying to adhere to the code, and she hates it when other people don't adhere to the code, right? And she's trying to make things go one way, and they're not that way, and so they're going a different way. And but she's going to go down fighting no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, virtually no one else seems to have that reaction. Everyone else seems to be on Rhaenyra's side, including my wife. And everyone seems to think Alicent is being positioned as kind of the villain for the rest of the season in some ways. But Yeah, I guess I kind of sympathize most with Alicent because she was put in a tough situation. She seems to be one of the smartest characters about like what's actually happening. When she's telling Aemon like, "Hey, your existence is the threat. Like we need to prisoner's dilemma plan for the worst possible outcome." And that's
Aegon, right?
yeah. I'm sorry. Aegon, is that what you said? Yes, Aegon.
I
Sorry.
think you
Yeah.
said Aemon.
Yeah. I
Whatever.
apologize. I
Yes.
apologize. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I know what you mean. See, to me, it's
I'm
interesting
also
because
somebody. I'm also somebody who plans for worst case, low likelihood scenarios in my own life, and so
sure,
that's why I relate with Alicent the most. Okay,
dress rehearsal.
not because she's a MAGA supporter in Westeros. That is not why I would support Alicent. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean to me, that conversation between Alicent and Aegon in private, just the two of them, to me was one of the things that made me like stop empathizing with Alicent as much as I had been leading into this episode. Because like obviously at the start of the episode with the whole situation of Rhaenyra giving birth and immediately being summoned, I was like, all right, that's, -1 to you, Alicent. That's a messed up thing to do to someone that you were once very close with, who has a lot of like trauma and fear around childbirth.
Okay, yeah, that was not cool. I will acknowledge that was not cool. So I agree.
So it's like they started me off in this time jump being like, okay, I'm quickly losing the supportive feelings that I had for Alicent when she was a teenager and put in a very like terrible situation that she was trying to make the best of, right? And then that conversation with Aegon was when I was like, okay, she's like yelling at him being like, oh, how can you be this stupid to not know that like you're whatever? I'm like, that was your job to teach him that as he was growing up. Like who else was supposed to be having those, like, if you think that it's some failure that your son doesn't understand the position that he's in, like that was kind of on you. Like you could argue that's also on Viserys. We don't see Viserys do a single fatherly thing in this whole episode, aside from like watching from above and being like, oh, stop that, Aegon. And then like nobody listens to him. I don't even think anybody can hear him from up there. He's just like talking to himself, drinking out of his flask, hanging out, looking like on death's door as the episode goes on. But yeah, I don't know. So this episode did a lot to chip away the emotional empathy I had for Alicent heading into it. But again, that's why I kind of like that we got this prequel and a prequel, because if they had just started me off with this version of Alicent, I would have very little empathy for her. Whereas at least I know all of the things that she had to endure and the isolation that she was exposed, like that she was put under. I feel that more for her now. Whereas if they had
the way that Game of Thrones would have conveyed that is in through dialogue and monologues. Like Alicent sits down with her handmaiden at one point and is like, when I first became a queen and I was only 16 years old, but and then like that's how they did it in Game of Thrones. They did that in Game of Thrones tons of times,
Yeah.
And I think it would have been a totally legitimate approach to this as well. But they chose to do it a different way by making these characters played by actors that we ended up really loving and then taking it away from us halfway through the season. So
isn't that a shame that like the thing that is now a criticism is like you did too good of a job with those first 5 episodes.
You can imagine too, like if they had done a shittier job and only did like 1 episode with the old actors, like that would have been, I think, a far less jarring transition as well. And it's like, oh, okay, that was just a prologue. Now we're in the main thing. Instead, it feels like we've been interrupted mid-story. Now, I'll just say this. I debated long and hard about whether or not I should include all of my complaints of the time jumps in this episode. I thought, hey, Kim, maybe we should do it like a bonus episode and just sort of contain my complaining to that bonus episode. But instead, I've kind of interwoven it throughout this episode, and so I feel like it's completely out of my system now. I want to say thank you to you, Kim, and the listeners for listening to my complaining. I'm really gonna make a genuine effort to try not to complain about it in future weeks. And also, I think there's going to be fewer time jumps in future weeks. So, but I had to just get it all out of my system now. And probably because this episode is so long, there's not going to be a bonus episode this week at decodingtv.com. But I'm just grateful for people to listen to me. And thank you for your patience, period, the end about it. And hopefully I shall only speak occasionally about it from this point forward. So
I hope next episode heals your soul a little bit.
Next episode, 3 minutes later. Time.
Yeah,
we pick up right. It picks up right in that Alicent Larys conversation where he's like, I murdered this guy. And then it's like, where we pick up a moment afterwards where she's like, well, that's not cool. And that will be the smallest time jump in House of the Dragon history. So
Great.
All right. You can find more episodes of this podcast at acastofkings.com. Find us on Twitter at acastofkings, on TikTok at acastofkings, on YouTube at youtube.com/acastofkings, and email us at acastofkings@gmail.com. If you want to support this podcast, become a paid member at decodingtv.com. Until next week, she is Kim Renfro. I am David Chen. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you later.
Goodbye.